Bonus on Israel, Part 2. This is Matthew, and in this episode of Still Unbelievable, Andrew and I continue our conversation with Eric. In the second part, we move on from the past history into present day and the existing conflict in Gaza. As usual, please make use of the links in the show notes where I have fact-checked as many of the claims made as I can. When considering the current conflict in Gaza, the old adage that truth is always the first casualty of war is very apt. The alleged hospital bombing in Gaza is brought up, and it does in fact appear to be the case that it was a misfired Hamas rocket that caused the damage, and that the number of casualties are vastly overstated. Reference is also made to Hamas militants beheading babies. This is a claim that is uncorroborated, and the reporter who originally stated it has apologised. One thing that I did not expect during this discussion was hearing Eric describe the UN as anti-Semitic. It did remind me of when I used to hear Christians call the UN anti-Christian. There are links about this in the show notes, but finding confirmation that the UN is anti-Semitic is difficult. The only sources I could find that affirm this are Jewish sources. And hello, we're back to part 2 of talking with Eric about Israel, a history of Israel. Go listen to part 1 if you've not listened to it. A very sketchy, very potted, very sprinty history of Israel. We've tried to cover some bits in more depth than others. I think the episode, I haven't finished editing it at the time I'm talking now, but I think it'll be around about 3 hours. I hope it didn't bore you. I found it fascinating. Now we're into, that took us effectively up to World War II, and now we're into the meat and potatoes, so to speak, of the story that we're trying to tell here. World War II, the modern state of Israel, how did it form, and moving on from there. But before we get to that, Andrew, there was something that came up in the last episode that you wanted to raise and talk about. So do you want to hit with that before we jump into post-World War II and the creation of Israel?
Yeah, just for a moment, I think it's useful to sort of help the listeners level set about where our show stands in regard to the current conflict. What are our views and how have they changed as a result of the last show, that kind of thing. So let me jump right in and say that part of this discussion will be about hereditary right to some portion of land on our planet. I question hereditary right to land. I don't use the Bible as an authoritative guide to right to land ownership. I am a humanist. I don't, as far as I can tell, I'm not aware that there is a God. So for those of you who wonder, has that changed? No. We are not anti-Semites on this show. That also hasn't changed. But in regard to hereditary right of land, the science that we have today suggests that, first, evolution is the best model we have for human development. And second, that we all came out of Africa. And so we might all say then that we all have, to some extent, a hereditary right to occupy Africa. And then you might say, and as our percentage of DNA markers increase, we have more right to that land. And then you might say, look, we all have Neanderthal markers. Some of us as much as 4%. Does that 4% marker give us right to some land? And if not, why not? But we could go further. We could say maybe everyone has a hereditary right to some land. And maybe you have more than 4% Neanderthal markers in your DNA, and that gives you access to right to some spot of land on the globe, and other people will battle that claim of right to land based on better land use or current control of the land, or some moral or ethical obligation that outweighs a hereditary right to land. Those are all conversations that we as human beings have to deal with. And to that end, I think this conversation is worth having. I also think that it's quite a difficult conversation. So we at Still Unbelievable, we're all aware that this is not easy. Today, we don't, well, I'll speak for myself. I suspect Matthew feels the same, but I don't know. I am not in favor of a strong hereditary right, and I'm certainly not in favor of a strong hereditary right based on religious claim. That doesn't mean that there can be no hereditary right. The Jewish nation appreciates the fundamentalist Christians' support for, I understand that. I don't support fundamentalist Christian ideology. That doesn't put me in the anti-Semite camp. But to support Israel, I do that on a different set of foundations than fundamental Christianity. And so in case anyone out there is wondering, none of those things have changed for me as a podcaster on Still Unbelievable. And because of all of those things, I'm looking forward to today's show, to understanding more about the claims. And today's show will be much more propositional than the last show. So we're going to do our best to have a conversation and to be more of the Still Unbelievable style that you listeners have come to appreciate. And so thank you again for joining us. If either of you two would like to say something to that opening, I'm certainly very willing to listen.
Go ahead, Eric.
I just wanted to, and I thank you so much for those words, and it helps to, direct where we go from here and the things that we're going to talk about. And I can appreciate everything that you're saying. And just so you know, as a historian, I do not make religious claims to the land.
Sure.
The reason that I gave
that
you
too,
history,
and you didn't in the last show either, and I appreciated that, so that you know.
And I give you the history not to claim that because we were there, quote unquote, first, it's the Jews' land. It's more so because there has been, depending on how you want to look at it, a between 50 and 80-year campaign to try to erase Jewish history to the land altogether, and to say that we only just arrived, as colonizers post World War II. And so I feel it's incumbent upon me to share at least some of the history that goes back for literally almost 4,000 years in this land, and that there has always been a Jewish presence of some kind in this land. So I did not say that, and that's supposed to shut the door and drop the mic, and that means it's ours because we were here first. Like, no, I mean, I'm living in Florida right now, probably on land that was once occupied by Seminole Indians. I mean, I understand that by Native Americans. I mean, what would you say about, basically Canada and all the First Nations, about Australia, and the Aboriginals? I mean, the point that I do think is important when there are people out there trying to deny the Jewish history to the land is to actually show that not only did the Jews have history in the land, but the Jews are actually the indigenous people to the land. That does not mean that therefore the indigenous people have a greater claim over anybody else. The point that I would agree with if somebody was trying to make it is the Jews have a valid claim to this land. Palestinian Arabs have a valid claim to this land. It's not about whose claim is quote unquote better. I don't care. We both have a claim to the whole land, and the goal is to try to find a way to share it in peace. But if we are being denied, even though this was a known fact literally for thousands of years, including among Muslims and in Muslim writings, over the last 50 years, there have been Palestinian leaders that have denied that there was even a Jewish temple in Jerusalem. They say that, Jews are Judaizing Jerusalem. There is no more Jewish place on earth than Jerusalem. There never has been. It's a ridiculous thing to say. But Mahmoud Abbas, who is the same person, who is the head of the Palestinian Authority, he's currently on the, I believe, 18th year of his 4-year term. You heard that correctly. No elections called since the end of his first term. Let's see. 16, well, I can't do math very well, but 14 years ago. Anyway, he denies the Holocaust. He denies that there was any Jewish connection to this land. And the problem is, think about it as in, that the Nazis took over Germany in 1933. I always hate using Nazi references because, obviously it was a sort of a one-of-a-kind type of thing. But it's something, especially to a British audience, that you know and understand as part of history, because we wouldn't have ultimately beaten the Nazis without you, and you guys suffered at the hands of the Nazis, as much as a lot of people, certainly with the V2s and otherwise, and the Blitz of London. But what happened, the way that the Nazis took over the school systems and set up the Hitler Youth, they created a single narrative for the people that was all the Nazi narrative. They, instead of, they would rise and they would salute and Heil Hitler, and from the morning until, the end of the day, they taught eugenics in class. By the time 1939, 1940, 1941 came around and they were fighting this war, a lot of those kids that had grown up only knowing that were now fighting the war for Hitler. And so they believed in it and were ready to die for it. Because it was all they knew. And in a way, I feel bad for a lot of, Palestinians today, because it's all they know. And I have been able to find and speak with Palestinians who managed to get out of that and away from that and had enough intellectual curiosity to learn. And they're shocked by how much of what they were taught in their schools and at their mosques was just lies. They are taught that Jews are apes, sons of apes and pigs. And okay, anyway, you were about to speak, so go ahead.
Well, just to have some back and forth, and I think, Matthew, you may have some things that you want to say at this point. But first and foremost, I don't have a reason, and I don't expect a reason, to deny that the Jewish people have continuously occupied the portion of land that we're talking about. I am not in any way defending the idea of erasing a population, of moving people out of their homes, of erasing culture and cultural heritage, of getting rid of important art in this world. Nothing like that. I do want to echo that I think you were exactly right, that it is incumbent on all of us to find a way to live peacefully on this planet. And to the extent that I think there is some fundamental religion that says, look, we're looking forward to an end time when this old world is essentially burned to a cinder and we can all live in glory. I don't hold to that view. And so to the extent that any of our current problems are tied to that kind of thinking, just back up. Not you, Eric, sorry.
No, I understand what you're saying, and I agree with you.
Yeah,
and
just so you know, of that view. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead. I didn't realize you were still continuing. Please.
Well, and one more thought, because I think this is important for our conversation today.
Please.
The UPenn and Harvard problem, I think, is a real problem. Now, I'm pretty left-wing. In fact, I'm so far left that I use my telescope to see the center line, right? I mean, you gotta. I'm pretty.
I appreciate the honesty. That's fine. I try to stay out of politics as much as possible and in history, but it's always good when we can admit our own biases, because everybody has them.
I'm left, but here's the problem. I actually agree in the United States that our left-leaning tendency of late has been to narrow, to some extent, the ability to speak freely in opposition to left-leaning values. And to the extent that Harvard and UPenn and any other school, any other organization, has not been full-throatedly denouncing the Hamas attacks on Israel, they're dead wrong. I'm as left as you're.
Thank you for saying that, Andrew. Thank you. Because I agree with you. And it's important to hear that from more people. So I just wanted to say thank you for your moral clarity.
Well, certainly. But, I said this last time around too, right? This is not new. They have been remarkably, and it took days. It took days to say, that's just wrong. That's wrong on every level. And we as an organization, in this case, I'm speaking of Harvard and UPenn, they didn't just come out and say it without equivocation. And I think that was ethically reprehensible. Matthew, you've had zero chance to say anything. Are you?
No, it's all right. Well, I want to get on with the history bit. So.
Oh, sure. Okay.
Because we arrived at World War II just about at the end of the last episode, Eric. And this is a bit where things start to get complicated, and probably where some of the difficult relationships with Israel and its neighbours started to properly come to the front.
If it's okay with you, I would just like to give a sort of very brief overview of where things stand in the current conflict, just because people listening to this, it's not going to be today, and things are going to be different by the time they're listening. As of today, we know that more than 1,400 Israelis have now been found deceased, a lot of them mutilated and burned, unfortunately, in that 10/7 attack. There's about 5,000 more that are injured, many of whom are still critically injured, so that death toll could also rise from that. We know there's at least 203 people kidnapped and currently held captive in Gaza by the terrorist group Hamas, 30 of whom at least are children, 20 of whom at least are elderly. And just since I know that I'm speaking at least partially with a British audience, I think it's important that you know that we know of at least 9 British citizens who were murdered by Hamas on 10/7. And we know of at least 7 more that are missing, meaning they're either held captive by Hamas in Gaza, or they're deceased and have not been located yet, or were burned beyond recognition. Just one very quick example, because I have such a problem with statistics when it comes to this. There's that famous saying that nobody actually knows if it came from him, but that supposedly Stalin said, that one death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic. And so I just wanted to sort of personalize it a little bit. And there's a British family, the Sharabi family. Their 13-year-old girl, Yael, and her mother, Leanne, were viciously mutilated by Hamas. These are British nationals. They're the 16-year-old sister of Yael and daughter of Leanne, and along with her father, Eli, have been kidnapped and are currently being held captive by Hamas. So this touches a lot of different nations, a lot of different people. It touches Britain directly. It touches America directly. We have our own citizens that are not, Israeli, or that may have dual citizenship with Israel, depending on, who they are. They may have just been visiting tourists. A lot of the people that were murdered were there for a music fest to celebrate peace and to promote peace. That was the point of this music festival that was attacked, where over 200 young people and teenagers, the kids in their 20s and 30s, were viciously murdered. It was one of the first places that Hamas attacked, in addition to, kibbutzim, which are just small Jewish communities, somewhat near to Gaza. So I just wanted to start there, just to let you know where we are, and to also make sure that you understand, that this should be personal to you too. Hamas attacked and is holding hostage and murdered British civilians and American civilians, and Canadians and Germans and Australians. It's a lot. So it's just wanted to make sure that was sort of known.
Are there any statistics for the Palestinian casualties? Because we know innocent Palestinians have also perished.
Of course. Here's what I'm going to tell you about that. Number one is every time you hear of a certain number of casualties from the Palestinian side, you must know and then be aware that when they say the Palestinian Health Authority of Gaza, that's Hamas. Hamas runs Gaza. They are the government in Gaza. It is a Hamastan. That is what it is. The Palestinian Authority has no authority. They were thrown out in a bloody coup in 2007, and they do not distinguish between, those deceased who are civilians and those deceased who are Hamas fighters. They just give total numbers. The other thing is, while Israel has done everything in its power to try to reduce civilian casualties to every extent possible, that it is Hamas's goal to make sure there are as many deaths as possible of Israelis and that there are as many deaths as possible of Palestinians, because that ends up being very cynically, macabre, and disgustingly a Hamas public relations victory. If they can show a dead, it's literally, when they raided Arafat's compound in, I think, 2003, right around there. There were papers written up about it. They call it the dead baby policy. It's essentially, if you can put pictures of dead babies on television and show it to people, that you're going to gain the sympathy of the world, regardless of who, quote unquote, started it. There's a lot of questions of what exactly is happening. The most important thing to remember, and the thing that you're not seeing enough of, is the why. Every single person who has died as a result of Hamas's actions, obviously the Israelis have to respond, and the Israelis have, while there have been many, you can call skirmishes or military actions against Hamas in Gaza over the years, times like 2008, 2012, 2014, 2021. This is the first time Israel has actually declared war on Gaza, and it's because on Gaza, specifically on Hamas. And that's actually one really important thing. This should never be referred to as a war between Israel and the Palestinians, because it is not. It is a war between Israel and Hamas, the terrorist organization, the organization that uses, and it has been documented for at least 2 decades, human shields. They place children all around their homes and compounds. The Hamas headquarters is in a hospital. Everybody knows this. They shoot rockets from mosques. They shoot rockets from schools. They shoot rockets from apartment buildings, all because it is a deterrence to try to keep Israel from being able to retaliate. And because if Israel retaliates, they know that even the most precision guided, weapons, highest technology in the world are going to lead to some civilian casualties. So Israel does everything that they can. They drop leaflets, they make phone calls, they send text messages, they do what's called the knock on the roof. There is no strategic surprise for Israel. Israel announces every place they're going to hit before they hit it. And they do everything they can to get civilians out and away. And the commanders always have the ability to call off strikes because they're watching them, either satellite or drones. And if they see that there are obviously civilians in the area, you can watch YouTube clips on this. You can actually see, what they're trying to hit. There are civilians in the area. They call off the strike. It happens all the time. It's a very difficult war to fight. This is not just two armies in a battlefield. Hamas wears civilian clothing. It's hard for you to see even who is Hamas. So it really requires intelligence more than anything else. And by intelligence, I mean CIA, MI6, that the intelligence in terms of knowing, where Hamas infrastructure is, where they're building their weapons, where their, members are either hiding or whatever, more money has gone into Gaza than per capita than any other place on earth in terms of donations in the last 20 years. What Gaza could have become when Israel disengaged in 2005, and I do think we should talk about that. Israel tried to make peace with the Palestinians in 2000, 2001 in particular. That was the Camp David talks with Bill Clinton and at the time a very dovish Israeli prime minister named Ehud Barak, and the Palestinian Authority leader at the time, Yasser Arafat, and it was turned down. Everything was offered, but the thing that Arafat could not bring himself to do was the final demand, which is a termination of all claims. In other words, this is the end of the conflict. This is not a man who was prepared to do any sort of state building and actually be a leader of people. His goal had always been to, quote unquote, liberate all of Palestine. For him to now accept any just portion of that land and have to suddenly rule it when he had been stealing money that was being donated by people for years, to the point where he died a multi-billionaire and had his money held in offshore accounts under his wife's name. It's well known. Their current leader, Mahmoud Abbas, also is a billionaire, flies around on a $50 million jet. They have no incentive to make peace, because that's when the hard work begins. For now, they just continue getting donations at rapid speed that they can steal. They're treated like a head of state as they go around to different countries. Well, in Gaza, it's worse, because what's running Gaza is not the Palestinian Authority, which isn't good. It comes out of the PLO, which was a terror organization that, was involved in the 72 Munich Olympics massacre of 11 Israeli athletes, was involved in 100 plus hijackings of planes, long before, 9/11, going back to the 70s. Not good, but it's very different from Hamas. Hamas is much closer to ISIS. And that is because Hamas's goal, it's in their charter, you can just take their word for it. Hamas's goal is an Islamic caliphate over the world, but starting with what they call Palestine.
Is that a published manifesto?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. It said, I believe that the very first words of the Hamas charter from 1987 or 88, when it was first formed, is the land of Palestine is occupied and will remain that way until Islam rises up and destroys the Jews, something along those lines. And the Hamas charter does not just call for liberation of Palestine. It does not even just call for genocide of the Jews living in Palestine. It calls for a genocide of Jews everywhere. It calls for attacks against Jews globally, just like they called for that day of rage globally last Friday. Thank goodness, a couple of people were stabbed in a couple of different countries, but for the most part, while there were a lot of very disheartening rallies that were pro-Hamas, there were no major attacks against Jewish institutions. But I've got to tell you, the Jewish institutions now look like fortresses. It's really just a very sad thing that's happened. I mean, Jewish kindergartens now have, cops surrounding them that are well armed to deter people at all times. This is happening in London as well. It's happening everywhere. Something happens, people try to separate this idea of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, and I tried to explain that a little bit more, in the last show. But what I'll tell you is, if you want to be able to figure out the difference, realize that when something's happening in Israel that people might not like, they attack Jewish institutions, they attack synagogues around the world. They don't just go after, an Israeli embassy or consulate or something like that. They go after Jews worldwide, regardless if they don't stop and ask them if they're Zionists. They don't stop and ask them if they support the state of Israel in any way.
And the same happens the other way as well, because after the 9/11 attacks in America, mosques and Muslims had suffered exactly the same fates here in the UK. People were doing exactly so. It's certainly not unique. That's how people are. They identify one atrocity with everybody who has any kind of relationship to the perpetrators of that atrocity.
That's fair enough. I would say that there is a little bit of a difference between those things, but I don't really feel the need to. Any sort of collective punishment to an entire people, that's what's been done to the Jews forever, right? They try to say that they don't say that a Jew did something wrong. It's the Jews. That basically, the most famous would be the Dreyfus affair in the late 19th century in France. Alfred Dreyfus was the highest ranking Jewish officer in the French military. And he was, as it turned out, you may have heard of J'accuse. You may have seen a lot of that after, the Charlie Hebdo shootings and things like that. That all arises out of this circumstance, the Dreyfus affair. But he was accused of passing French secrets to the Germans. They knew it then, and it's not even debatable now that there was no evidence against him and that they basically just blamed the Jew. And it was made into a huge spectacle where he was, ripped of his rank, and his sword was snapped over the knee, of his superior officer, and he was put in jail for quite a long time. And it was Zola, Emile Zola. He's the one who did the actual legwork to prove that he had nothing to do with it. And that was the big headline in the French papers was J'accuse. And he was accusing all of these different people of being involved in this conspiracy to go against Dreyfus. But the reason I bring it up is because at that event, that show where they were just humiliating Dreyfus, you did not hear the crowd scream, "Death to the traitor." You did not hear the crowd scream, "Death to Dreyfus." You heard "Death to the Jews." That's what they were saying. So Jews understand what it is to be have people blame an entire group for the even alleged actions of one, even if they were not real actions. And so I do not promote that against anybody, including Arabs and Muslims. Everybody, I judge people on their individual merit, their individual personality, their individual thoughts and feelings, their individual open-mindedness. I do not judge them based off of their immutable characteristics or because of the tribe or group to which they may belong. So even though I would say that the circumstances are different, I don't want to argue with it because ultimately I'm in favor of what you just said in terms of condemning that as well.
Taking a break for a moment, for the listeners, there will be two links in the show notes. One is to the United Nations keeps track of casualties in the conflict in and around Gaza, the West Bank, Israel, Palestine. They have a portion of the United Nations website devoted to that. There's a link to it in the show notes for the casualties. They started tracking in 2008. It's broken down by year and by several categories. The number of men killed, the number of women, the number of children, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't have access as a podcaster to better information than that. But if you're interested in the casualty statistics, it'll be in the show notes. The second thing, Eric, you mentioned the Hamas Covenant that is largely sort of the marching orders for today, right? That 1988 Hamas Covenant will also be in the show notes. And in fact, I put it in an email to all three of us just while we were sitting here. So if one of you wants to have a look through it as we're talking and reflect on the couple of opening paragraphs, it's pretty nasty business. So that will also be in the show notes for the listeners.
Okay, great.
I think
you want to get to the history, right?
yeah, I do. I'm very much aware that I promised the history and we're half an hour in and we haven't got there. But just to pick up on the thing that you say, what's going through my mind is what limited history I'm aware of is that reciprocal action typically results in more reciprocal action. And 9/11 showed us that. World War One showed us that. I'm sure there are a bazillion other conflicts that we can list which showed us this kind of cycle. And I don't question at all what you've told me about the Jewish experience. I'm not a Jew, so I can't replicate that experience, but I have no reason to question it. But I'm fairly sure that there are Muslims in this country, because of what I mentioned earlier about post 9/11 and also our own terror attacks here in the UK, that there are Muslims who feel that. I've seen it on some forums and on other social media pages. There are Muslims who feel the same about the British, about that the British do these things to them, and the Muslims are always accused first of these kind of things. So what I'm getting to is this cycle that we're in currently. There's a high risk that we're going to create, the royal we, the world, whatever, is going to create a whole generation of Muslims who feel the same way about themselves and the rest of the world as the Jews do about their history in terms of being persecuted. Whether there's equivalence, I don't think is relevant. It's how they feel, and that they feel that the rest of the world hates them, and that the only way to escape from that hatred is to eradicate the rest of the world. And I'm wondering if what we're doing is we're sleepwalking into a scenario where this cycle of violence begetting violence is creating an entire generation of people who, for reasons that are only because of what we've done to their parents, want us eradicated.
If you take a moment and open that link I sent you right now, I think you'll find that generation has already passed. Just read the first two paragraphs of the link I sent you. This is the Hamas Covenant, 1988. You just take a moment and glance through it as Eric responds.
I actually wanted to start out with, I'm going to say one thing and then I'm going to ask a question, and I'm going to see if that can sort of lead us down a discussion, okay? I understand the simplicity of and the seeming absolute truth to that people see when they look at it, when they refer to this as a cycle of violence. I'm going to try to explain to you why that's actually not a correct way to refer to what you're seeing here, but that's going to take a little bit of discussion. So the first question I want to ask you is, okay, you're aware that Israel, the modern state, came into being in 1948, yes?
Yes. Or thereabouts. I thought it was 47, but yeah, it's thereabouts, yeah.
May 1948.
Okay.
What came before Israel?
I have looked at a map and I have watched a couple of videos, but that knowledge is escaping me at the moment. I know there's talk about the British Ottoman Empire was covering that area as well, but I can't remember exactly the detail. But there are videos in the show notes to the first episode which talks about this kind of history.
I'm going to briefly do something because I want you to understand something. And that is, there has never in the history of planet Earth been a sovereign state of Palestine. Never. There has never been an Arab state of Palestine. Palestine, again, as we talked about the last time, is a Roman name given to the land by Emperor Hadrian after the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 CE, because he was mad that the Jews revolted for a third time, and he was vindictive in murdering 1 million Jews and trying to outlaw Judaism and change the name of our land from Judea, because we are the Jews, from Judea to Syria, Palestina, and just making it part of the larger land. Okay, before Israel, it was the British Mandate. The British Mandate came into effect in 1920. It lasted until May of 1948. The day that it ended is the day that Israel declared its independence. The very next day, 5 Arab armies invaded Israel with the express goal of it being a quote-unquote war of extermination.
Hold there for a moment. Let me ask you a question about that history. So leading up to, let's talk about the beginning of 1948. So let's say January to April, just for a moment, because I'm not familiar with the history that I'm about to inquire over. So mobilizing an army is not an instantaneous act. For instance, if the Soviet Union invaded the West Coast right now. Oh, okay, sorry. We've got satellites, so this won't feel like 1948. So go back, and we're in a time where we don't have satellites. Okay. So we get invaded. There's some large mobilization. It takes a while for armies to get themselves together and to respond. So when you say,
I might be able to get you a quick response to this one, if that's okay. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but just so you know, the Arab army started mobilizing after the UN partition plan vote, which was in November of 1947. They didn't invade until May of 1948. Yeah.
So
I thought I would just cut to the chase on that one.
Yeah, no, that's worth
yes.
So there's some anticipation that on some day in May 48, and by the way, I understand that it's 48 as well. There's some day in May, there's a declaration, and the next day there's an invasion. So that was what I wanted to know is how did the mobilization start? What was the conversation about the precursors to mobilization that led up to being able to prosecute some sort of war action the next day?
Okay, it's going to be a question of how much history you want. So I'm going to go through something really quickly, and then I'm going to slow down.
Podcast, unfortunately.
Of course. I'm going to run through basically just a little bit of an overview of history. That's not going to go back too far, but I just want it to be understood, and then we can all be on the same page. And then what I think you really need to understand is what the heck the British Mandate was, where it came from, what legal basis it had, what it was meant to do, and why the British just up and left and abandoned their mandate in 1948, which is what happened. So it's important to, I think, understand all this. So, okay, I'm going to just go back really quick. Before Israel, there was the British Mandate. Before the British Mandate, there was the Ottoman Empire, which existed for 400 years. The Ottomans were not Arabs. They were Turks. Okay, they're from Turkey. Their capital was in Constantinople. The land of Israel was just a distant part of the Ottoman Empire. And particularly during the last 200 years of Ottoman rule, when the Ottoman Empire was very slowly crumbling, they didn't have the money or the ability to keep up that land. So that by the time the mid to late 1800s rolled around, it had been mostly abandoned because it was filled with malarial swamps and arid desert. Nobody could live there. That's why you'll see there's a book that Mark Twain went on an expedition to visit the Holy Land, in the 1800s. And he wrote a book called The Innocents Abroad. And he talks about in that book how desolate, how upsetting it was to see how desolate it was, that there were no communities, that you would meet a few Jews, you'd meet a few Christians, you could meet a few Muslims, but mostly it was these, it was just desolate open land because it had just been war torn for the previous 1,000+ years. And it had been then severely neglected by the Ottomans. The only reason that land became livable, let alone to thrive, is because the Jews returned with the purpose of doing exactly that. The Jews did not come. There were no, when colonists colonize an area, first of all, they have to be coming from somewhere. The Jews came from all over the world. They were not coming from any one specific empire, but also they come to exploit the resources and the people of the land. There were neither. They used to refer to it back then, and this does not mean the land was empty, but what they said was it's a land without a people for a people without a land. That didn't mean the land didn't have any people. It meant that the land didn't have any cohesive single group of people that self-identified with that land, not like the Palestinians do today, which is something that really only started to develop in the mid-60s after 1964 when the PLO was formed. At the time, it was a lot of Bedouins who are nomadic. who don't stay in one place. And then there were tribes, basically, who were only loyal to their own tribes. They did, maybe most of them, if not all of them, would have widely considered themselves Arabs, but nobody called them Palestinians. And actually, when the British arrived, the only people who were okay with them being called Palestinians, if you said Palestinians anytime between 1920 and 1948 up until the day of Israel's independence, you were talking about the Jews. Okay, the Jerusalem Post is probably the most widely read, English newspaper from Israel today. It was, before this founding of the state of Israel, called the Palestine Post. Okay, the Israel Philharmonic was called the Palestine, Philharmonic, or musical symphony, or whatever it was. Anything that had Palestine on it, if you see things, because people post this and it becomes a cell phone. It happens all the time. They post things that, if you say Palestine didn't exist, why does this say Palestine? And it turns out that it was referring to the Jews and, holding, cultural events and things like that in the area at the time. So anyway, before the British, there were the Ottoman Turks for 400 years. Before the Ottoman Turks, there were the Mongols. Before the Mongols, there were the Tartars. Before the Tartars, there were the non-Arab Egyptian Mamluks for a period of time. Before them were the Kurds, again, not Arabs. Before them, the Crusaders. Before them, the Kurds again. Before them, the Crusaders again. Obviously, they were switching hands a bit. Before them, the Seljuks. And then we get to the Arabs, okay? The Arabs first conquered the land, and that is what they did. It was an imperial act of empire building. They came out of Arabia between 636 and 638 CE, and that's when they conquered the land of Israel, which at the time still had, despite all the massacres, between 300 and 400,000 indigenous Jews living in that land, and they colonized those Jews. It's amazing because somehow the narrative has been flipped, but the Jews have always had a connection to this land, and they were the ones who were colonized. It happened beginning in 636 to 638, but Arab rule ended in that land in 1071. Okay? There has not been, first of all, there was no state even back then. There were just caliphates, the Umayyad Caliphate, the Abbasid Caliphate, different names for different Fatimid Caliphate, different names of caliphates, which included a broader land that included, Saudi Arabia and the Levant and, different areas like that. But there was never, the Arab state of Palestine or any other state under any other name there. There was just the broader caliphate.
So what I'm hearing from what I'm hearing from that is probably the story of every piece of land across the globe. You go back into its history. Yeah. It varies, it changes. Sometimes there's borders.
Jerusalem more than most.
Yeah. So
I just say that Jerusalem has been besieged 23 times, attacked 52 times, and captured and recaptured 44 times. Okay, it has been one of the most disputed and fought over pieces of land on the planet, if not the most. So I'm sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you there, but I just wanted to make sure that you understood that. That while that is true to some degree, it's also to dispel this notion that that the Jews were gone 2,000 years ago and the Arabs have been here ever since, and it's just not the truth. In fact, the land was largely desolate in the 1800s. We know that when Jews started moving back in terms of large numbers for political purposes to try to build a state, there were always Jews coming back from the diaspora going back 1,000 or more years. But in terms of an organized Zionist, what's called Aliyah, which means going up, and all it is, it's looked at not as immigration, but as a return to Israel. When that started, we know that there were no more than about 200,000 Arabs living in the entirety of that land, that they did not have a cohesive, structure that they all, organized under or identified under. These were just tribes living in different areas, and the Jews did not come in and kick anybody out. What first was happening was they were buying these malarial swamplands and arid desert that nobody wanted and paying exorbitant prices for it. So certainly it wasn't to their benefit there. I mean, it was all the rage for any Arabs who owned land there to sell to the Jews back in those days, including a lot of the early Palestinian nationalists. Their families all had sold land to Jews because they made outrageous sums of money. But the Jews came in, they drained the swamps, they made the desert bloom, they built communities there. And so while there was what is known as the old Yishuv, who were the Jews who have been there for centuries at least, this was the new Yishuv, which are the Jews who started to move there in order to build up a viable state. But they are those who lived there before 1948 when the state was created.
But those are people who are long gone generations ago. Why do you have a right to something that they did?
I'm sorry, say again. I didn't understand
the people that you're talking about, the people that drained the swamp, that occupied this land, they're long gone. They're gone generations ago. Why do you here today have a claim to something that people generations ago did?
Well, they built communities that are still there today. I mean, those communities were not just going to be torn down. Some communities that they built were destroyed by the Jordanians during the 48-49 Arab-Israeli War. In fact, because there was no distinction, there was no place called the West Bank until Jordan occupied that land after the war in 1949. The Jordanians literally ethnically cleansed the West Bank of its Jews. There was no delineating line between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and places like Shechem, Nablus, Bethlehem, Jericho, all these cities that are in the West Bank. It's not as if Jews were only building in Tel Aviv. They were building all over. For the first time in 3,000 years, there were no Jews living in Judea and Samaria. After the Jordanians came in the 48-49 war, and they either murdered, massacred, or threw out all of the Jews. That was their choice. And they also destroyed well over 100 synagogues. They destroyed Jewish communities or otherwise had Arabs move into those communities and take those homes that they were living in. They destroyed, there's a 2,500-year-old cemetery in Jerusalem called the Mount of Olives. They destroyed portions of that and used Jewish headstones for latrines and for building materials. Even according to the armistice, they were supposed to still allow Jews and Christians in to visit their holy sites, at least for pilgrimages during certain times of the year. Never during the 19-year Jordanian occupation of the West Bank did they ever let in a single Jew or a single Christian to visit their holy sites. Okay, they sat atop the Temple Mount for all 19 years with snipers. That's just the way that it was there. But what I think really needs to be understood in order for us to all be on the same page is, what happened in those decades prior to the state of Israel? What the heck is the British Mandate, and why did it become the land of Israel? And you're talking about claims, and what claim would I have or would any other Jew have? Well, I mean, we can talk about this in several ways. I can tell you the legal reasons why. When it comes to the moral reasons why, that obviously is more subjective. And in my opinion, it should always have been. And if you look back, it's what the Jews were trying to do, that these are two people who both care about this land, and they should both find a way to live here together in any one of a million different fashions that could be done. The problem is, and this is the last point I'm going to say about this, and then I want to go back and explain the mandate. I don't know if you guys know the name Ernest Bevin. He was the foreign minister of Great Britain just after World War II. He was widely known, this is not controversial to say, as a vicious anti-Semite, and it's just a fact. He was no friend to the Jews. Let's just put it that way. But he was in charge of Palestine policy for Britain after World War II. He's the one who was not allowing Holocaust survivors to immigrate to Israel. It was his policy. But when Britain was ready to just throw their hands up and give up on the mandate, Ernest Bevin stood up in the House of Commons and explained it and said, I'm going to do this to the best of my ability to actually get his words. Now, I don't have it in front of me, so there will be a certain amount of paraphrasing, but it's going to be close. So the Jewish point of principle, that's what we call it, the point of principle. The Jewish point of principle in Palestine is the creation of a Jewish state. The Arab point of principle in Palestine is to prevent the Jews from having a state. These two things are incompatible. It is not the Arabs want a state and the Jews want a state, and so let's find a way to share this. It was the Jews want a state and the Arabs want the Jews not to have one. Because there was nobody pushing for Palestine. You look through the 1947 partition plan. You look through the 1949 armistice lines that were drawn. Nobody's talking about a Palestinian Arab population. They say Arabs. The 47 partition plan that was recommended by the United Nations was one Jewish state and one Arab state. They didn't become Palestinians until the mid-60s. And there was a lot involved in that. Now, there is a Palestinian people today, and I don't want to deny them their identity, and I'm willing to accept that that is their identity and that they feel very strongly about it, and I'm willing to share the land with them. But it has been the truth since forever that basically it is an idea that it's two ideas happening at the same time. One is a religious view of once land is Islamic, it must always be Islamic. And therefore, since this land was at one time Islamic, it cannot then become Jewish because Islam replaced Christianity, which replaced Judaism in the mind of Muslims. I mean, that is not a controversial statement to make. That's what they believe. And I'm not putting them down for that. I'm just saying that that's what it is. Or the other reason is because it's what they've been taught. And what they've been taught is, and this is not me making this up, you can find it in their textbooks. There are Palestinian versions of Sesame Street where they're teaching this to kids. And you can go to, I would highly recommend you check out a website called Memri, MEMRI. And all they do is watch Arab television and read Arab newspapers, specifically in Palestinian territories, but in other areas as well. And they translate them because they speak Arabic so that people can see this is what they're actually teaching. This is what is on their televisions. This is what these leaders say to their people in Arabic, as opposed to what they say to, Joe Biden when they talk to him in Washington, D.C. And so you can see all of that stuff, and you can see that the narrative that they have all been taught and they all believe is that this land was the Arab Islamic land of Palestine, that the Jews are European colonizers who have no connection to this land, who came here for the first time in the early 1900s and started stealing our land, and they kicked us off the land. And it is now the duty of every Palestinian that the greatest honor is to be a shaheed, a martyr, to die for Palestine, to die for Allah. You see it from little children. It's heartbreaking. They have summer camps of tens of thousands, 30, 40,000 kids, specifically in Gaza with Hamas, where they're teaching them, they put on plays of them kidnapping Israeli soldiers. They have them running through these tunnels with machine guns unloaded or just plastic, depending on the age of the children. And they are teaching them hatred of the Jews. They're teaching them, that the Jews are usurpers and that they have no connection to this land. So either way, you either feel it's because for religious reasons, if it's Islamic once, it must always be Islamic. And if it goes back and is allowed to become Jewish, then what does that say about Islam? Or you have the brainwashed, it's all they've ever been taught, and it's a false history. It's one or the other.
I understand that, and I don't have a lot of difficulty believing most of what you say. I'll do what I can to find references and details. So listeners, please, show notes, I'll fact check as much as I can, and there'll be lots of links. There's already lots of links under episode 1, including a link to the British mandates that we've discussed earlier. My concern goes right back to a comment I made about half an hour ago about violence begetting violence. Yes, nations, when they're attacked, have have a duty even to defend themselves. I'm not going to deny that. But, and this is a really massive but, when violence follows violence in that, all it does is reinforce in the minds of those people who are being brainwashed, let's use that word, all it does is reinforce the truth of the lies that they've been told.
I
think we need to find a way to break the cycle. We doesn't mean me. I've got no skills to break that cycle. But I think those who can need to find a way to not fire rockets.
I understand what you're saying.
For me, Matthew, and that is, yes, violence begets violence. But there's also a sort of tit for tat that may or may not be included. Right, and so in statements like for every one of us that's killed, we're going to kill 5 of them or whatever. Right, there's not only war continuing political ends, right, but the things we say about how we're prosecuting a war matter. What we say about retribution versus defense matters, and so. We've got to do something about the rhetoric that's being used.
2 things that I'd like to say just in response to that. The first is the reason that you see any sort of cycle violence or tit for tat is because the world community has stopped Israel from doing what it's needed to do since 2008. Israel disengaged from Gaza. It uprooted over 1,000 Israeli families that were living in Gaza. It uprooted all of the military installations in Gaza. It left. It was basically a trial run. It was, we have no peace partner on the other side because we offered them everything and they said no, but we don't want to be in control of this land where so many people are living here that hate us and that, want to kill us. So we're going to give you all of this land. And there was no blockade. There was no siege. And Israel left them with a lot of infrastructure, including greenhouses that, they could have turned it into a Dubai. They could have turned it into a Singapore. They had that opportunity to do that. The world was ready to pour hundreds of millions of dollars into Gaza to help them make at least a Palestinian emirate, even if it wasn't going to be the final outcome. But what happened is in 2006, they held elections and the Palestinians of Gaza voted for Hamas. They voted for these terrorists who are committed to the genocide of every Jew on the planet, who are committed to never making a peace deal with Israel, who are committed in their charter to liberating every inch of Palestine. They voted for Hamas. There was a power struggle between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority between 2006 and 2007. It finally erupted into outright civil war in 2007 between Hamas and the PLO, the Palestinians, so between Mahmoud Abbas and between Khalid Mashal, I believe would be the leader of, or Sheikh Yassin of Hamas at the time. And Hamas slaughtered their own brethren. They slaughtered every PLO member. They were throwing them from rooftops and they otherwise exiled them, and they took over the entire territory. And there was no, you got this percentage, we got this percentage, there's a parliament and we're going to share and we're going to talk. No, it was, they took it over and they've now been running that enclave entirely since 2007. Finally, when Hamas took it over entirely, Israel no longer had any hopes left about what might happen with Gaza because it was now being run by the terrorists who did what you saw they did on October 7th. It's what they've been calling for. So they've done in smaller amounts for, decades going back. And they were firing rockets immediately into nearby neighborhoods like Sderot and places like that. And everything that was going into Gaza, instead of concrete being used to build homes and hospitals and schools, they're using it to build tunnels, to tunnel underground to get into Israel. Everything and they created it at like gangster rule. Like you hear now all this talking about Israel cutting off the electricity. Like Israel does not run their electricity. They have their own electricity, but they dole it out in amounts in a gangster-like fashion that you have to actually basically bribe people or know the right people with Hamas in order to get your electricity. Israel provides something like 10 to 20%. Yeah, sure.
Hold on for a second. Where I started a moment ago was that we have to be careful in prosecuting war, what political language we use while we're prosecuting the war, because there's a tributive kind of language that we can use, and there's a defensive kind of language that we can use. And we can talk about what happened in 2006. My point is that we all have, as sharers of this globe, responsibility to use the amount of violence necessary to defend ourselves and the language necessary to defend that amount of violence. And when we go beyond that and we start talking about retribution, I think we are into the position that Matthew is invading against, which is a violence that begets violence. And
fair. Yeah.
So, okay.
So fair. Let me tell you, there was a reason that I gave you that little bit of background, and it starts with the first sentence that I had come out with, which is the world hadn't let Israel do what it's needed to do since 2008, since Hamas really declared, not just declared, I mean, they've always been at war, but started firing in rockets by the thousands. And there would be these, mini wars where Israel would finally get sick of it because there have been, thousands of rockets raining down on their people. And this was before there was an Iron Dome. But that's the reason they came up with that technology, was to protect their people. But they fought these little skirmishes with them in 2008, 2014. There's so many of them, 2020, 2021. And basically, Israel was only allowed to do tit for tat because the world was coming in and getting on Israel for, saying that it was a disproportionate response. And you can believe what you want to believe on that, and we can discuss the legal meaning of disproportionate response, and we can discuss just how you feel it should mean. I don't know what the proportionate response would be to, 1,400 Jewish civilians being, murdered in their beds and women being raped and babies being beheaded. I don't know what the proportionate response is to that. However, what I can say is that Israel has needed to take the terrorist organization Hamas out the same way that the allied nations of the West have largely taken out ISIS. But Israel was never allowed to do it. They were always stopped before they could get that far. And now, because of what's happened, because they tried to keep some semblance of a relatively peaceful border where there was an understanding that every couple of years we're going to have, some of this tit for tat type of violence. Well, now, after they did what they did on 10/7, Israel's goal is not to hurt or kill a single Palestinian person. It is to wipe out the genocidal, Nazi-like Hamas terror organization. And that's what they will be working to do in the coming weeks and likely months. It's not going to be easy. It is not like fighting a regular army. But this is what Israel has been called on to do. They have to protect their citizens by ridding this world of Hamas terror. And by the way, they will be ridding the Palestinian people of Hamas terror, because under Hamas, they have no freedom of speech. Girls have almost no freedom whatsoever. LGBT, if you admit to that in Gaza, they throw you from the roof. Okay?
So let me come alongside that for a moment, because I do, boy, what an admission. Sorry, listeners, it's true. I've been reading non-U.S. papers during this time, so I've read some Al Jazeera. I've read pretty widely. Israel, the IDF, is not the only group that hates that this has happened. Okay, and they're not the only ones fighting. So Palestinian authorities are they're facing protest and backlash among the population of Gaza over this fighting
based on a lie. based on this lie that Israel bombed a hospital and killed 500 people, which everybody jumped on and caused protests around the world, and we now know it was a total lie. I mean, unfortunately, that's what happens. A lie can go around the world in seconds before the truth gets its pants on. That's what happened.
But backing up prior to the hospital bombing, because I am not military detective enough to.
It's unequivocal. I mean, there's video, there's drone footage, there's radar footage, and there's audio of Hamas speaking to one another saying this was us. So I mean,
I'm not sure rockets do U-turns.
Yeah.
Okay. There is at least one credible video that does suggest that the rocket launched from point of origin in Gaza and did make a sharp turn and that there's some sort of a misfire or a problem there that brought it back to the Baptist hospital in roughly central Gaza, slightly south of central Gaza, and killed hundreds of people. I am not military.
Most likely not.
I am
I'm
not
sorry. I just want you to know that.
expert enough to judge the credibility of the videos and decide whether this is within the capability of a rocket or outside the capability of a rocket or any of that kind of thing. And while the bombing at the hospital is absolutely reprehensible, it's actually not central to the point I'm making, which is prior to the hospital bombing. The citizens of Gaza were already against this sort of military against military response because this fight is being prosecuted among the citizenry of Gaza. Now, the hospital bombing is awful. That's awful. And it's awful no matter who did it. We have what is probably the most capable hospital in the region that is now essentially out of business.
That's Gaza, not my understanding, for what it's worth. For what it's worth, the satellite photos show that there's no crater, that it hasn't been destroyed, and it appears that something just fell and burned a whole lot of cars and probably killed some people in the parking lot. This wouldn't be the first time this happened. That you can find stories about the Jenin massacre that never happened. I mean, there are a lot of massacres that are claimed by Palestinian sources, usually terrorist organizations, that then after a few days, people actually go and find out that they never happened. So I'm just telling you that hospital is not shut down. That hospital is still in use, and 500 people did not die.
Good. Let's say that all of that is absolutely the case. The best numbers that I can find from 2021 suggest that there are 13 hospitals running in Gaza for a population of over 2 million people. I did a little math. I came up with something like 180,000 people per hospital. We could probably have some discussion about, are there community hospitals, are there the resources, that sort of thing. But Gaza is not a place that has great health care. And I am against fighting around those infrastructure assets for any purpose at all on either side.
You understand that Hamas has its headquarters in a hospital?
I do.
Because they know exactly what you're saying.
Sure. Yeah. And I know that the common tactic is to take hostages and keep them in civilian populated areas. I know that some terrorist organizations, this was common in Iraq back in in Libya in the 1980s, placing anti-aircraft batteries on elementary schools, that kind of thing, right? So you're fighting this sort of horrific war where you depend on the ethics of the other person not to go after your military assets because there are deliberately innocent, in scare quotes, civilians, in and among the military assets. So yes, I absolutely understand, but that actually leads to my objection for either side to fight around. And that's what I said. If you go back and listen carefully, I said I'm against either side fighting around those assets.
I understand, and I agree with you, and I wish that it could be entirely avoided. And every single life lost is a tragedy. It does. A Jewish life is not worth more than a Palestinian life. Neither is a Palestinian life worth more than a Jewish life. Every life lost, it's somebody's mother, father, sister, brother, child. Every life matters. You have to understand that every time Hamas fires a rocket, they're committing a double war crime. This is not that you have a lawyer speaking to you now. I'm telling you, and I can point you to the statutes if I need to. They're committing a double war crime because they are firing on civilian populations from civilian populations. Either one of those is a war crime, and they're doing both.
I'm interested in those resources just for the show notes, not because I question your legitimacy as a legal professional, but because those kinds of things
I'd be happy to provide
help our listeners.
Yeah. And I really did want to get into a little bit of the legal more, depending on how much time we have, because that really, if we talk about the British mandate and things like that, and who does the land legally belong to and all that stuff, that kind of, nothing that has anything to do with the Bible, nothing that has to do anything with who came here before, it just has to do with title to the land. If you have an interest in that, I would love to go through it with you. But otherwise, I'm happy to continue, this conversation that we're having now.
Sure.
But the bottom line is that, the UN was, first of all, you mentioned you could go to the UN to find statistics. The UN also gets their statistics from Hamas. Okay, sure. The UN doesn't have any special people getting statistics from a different place. And the UN is probably one of the most anti-Semitic organizations on the planet. And that is maybe time for another podcast because there is too much for me to say about that. But I can just put it this way. In the last 5 years, there's been something like 30 so many more than that. 30 times the number of resolutions passed against Israel than against Iran, Syria, North Korea, Russia, Pakistan, I'm trying to think, Cuba combined.
You were in an interesting spot a second ago. No, come back to it. I'm sorry to interrupt, but you were in an interesting spot because this looks like it's going to carry on for a while. And I don't want to stop here at part 2 because I'm aware that both of you have things coming up today that are going to, we're going to hit a hard stop where everybody has to go their own ways. And knowing that you're interested in this, I am completely willing to set aside time on a regular basis until we come to some kind of resolution so that we can keep talking through this. I think it's an interesting space for listeners to tune in and gain some education and hopefully some neutral perspectives and all that sort of thing. So if you're game, I'm game, and of course
I am.
If Matthew is,
and more than that, I actually appreciate it because I'm going to be honest. When we have these conversations, and I know time is limited, that I do have this feeling in my chest of there's certain things I've got to get out there. They're just too important. If I knew that we could slow it down, our conversations would be probably a little bit more productive. And I do apologize for the couple of times I interrupted you. I don't like that, and that's something I'm going to try to clean up. But I'm just saying that knowing that we had more time.
No, that makes good podcasting when everybody cares enough to try to get hold of the mic. That actually makes a good podcast. I'm trying to look in Matthew's eyes over there.
No, you guys carry on. Yeah, don't talk about scheduling. Talk about what it is you want to talk about.
What do you think about a part 3, et cetera, moving forward?
We're probably a month away from that because our listeners know, I'm in middle of play season. I've got a play I need to be front of house for next week, and then I've got 2 weeks of rehearsals before a play that I'm in the middle of November. Second half of November, Angela and I've got to prepare for a really important author interview, so that's nice hint, listeners. So there's lots going on. So we can, but it won't be until end of November before we can even seriously think about scheduling again.
If I could say 2 things really quick. One, I don't want to make promises on this yet because I'd be speaking for another person, but it's something that your podcasters may be interested in. I'm in the process of speaking with a Palestinian national who actually lives in Wales. And I'm hoping that we will be able to do something together in like a Zoom kind of way. And that might be something that some of your listeners would like to hear from him and from me. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that'd be great. And that's also what I wanted to suggest to you guys as well, is that we don't have to always come back. If you guys are interested, but you want to do it in a way that requires a lot less production, I'd be happy to do live things with you as well on Zoom or otherwise, spaces, anything really. this to me is the most important thing in the world right now, because I believe that the Jewish state is facing an existential threat from the North and the South, which all comes from Iran. The more people know and understand what's happening there, the more I feel like my life has value and has made a difference. I'm not there fighting right now. This is my quote unquote fight. And all it is to try to get truth out. Because anytime I say anything, it is said in 100% good faith that is a historical fact. If somebody comes to me and says I was wrong, I will say, please show me. And I will happily admit it and correct myself. And my goal here is not to tell you a story, a narrative, to just be another regurgitator of one-sided stories. I am giving you historical facts and legal analysis from a historian and a lawyer. And I'm also fallible and will admit it when I'm wrong, and it's never intentional. So that's my promise to you now and to your listeners always and going forward. And I don't mind being called out if I said something wrong, and not at all. In fact, I think it's good because I'm still learning every day too. I want to give a little bit of the background here because I'm happy to always talk about, and it's important to talk about the current events and how we got here and things like that. But the history also does matter. And this part also involves Britain, so it will be interesting to your British listeners, I think. So I want to talk about the mandate a little bit. I'm going to try to get through this part of it kind of quickly. So it's going to be more of an overview. It's going to be a little bit of a legal analysis in there as well. But I think it's important to know how we got to where we are today, with there being a state of Israel, with there not being a state of Palestine or any other Arab state, in the area from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River. Okay, so this is what you need to know. World War I is coming to an end around 1917, and Foreign Minister Lord Arthur Balfour issues the Balfour Declaration, which, His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine, will do its best endeavors to encourage immigration and settlement on the land for the purposes thereof. I mean, that's pretty close to what it is. I'm sure I got some words wrong in there, but at least the very first line and a half or so is correct. That had no legal validity whatsoever, but it was cause for celebration among Jews because the British Empire, that was, the way that people, I guess, in a way, look at the United States today. It was the world power. The sun never set on the British Empire. And the British Empire is supporting this Zionist idea that had already been in motion. Jews had already been building this state in this land for decades, for many decades already. But regardless, it was simple. That when the League of Nations and they had the, Versailles, and then they had San Remo. But basically, 1917, Britain comes into possession of the land that they call Palestine. And they have that land all the way through to Mesopotamia, which is today Iraq. North of them, the French have Lebanon and Syria. Okay, that's where the fighting stopped. And what was in the air at that time was, the idea of, in the past, the French and the English would have happily just taken these territories as their colonies. They fought them in a defensive war. They would have just taken them. But there was democracy in the air. And the League of Nations decided that what they were going to do is that there were these peoples that lived in all of these areas that you couldn't just give them a state because they wouldn't know what the heck to do with anything right now. They needed to organize, they needed state building. So they created this system of mandates. Okay, they gave out 15 of them. Okay, that the British mandate for Palestine was only one of 15. Okay, they split up the entire empire of Imperial Germany, which included a lot of places in Africa and also a lot of islands in the Pacific. And they split up the entire Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. The entire modern Middle East, which is where our focus would be, comes from the mandate system. All of those borders are the same as what was written then, whether they were, accurate, whether they were fair. Largely they were just drawn in there by, some Brits and some French. Let's just be honest.
They did the same in Africa at some points. They just grabbed a ruler, just found the spot on the map and drew a straight line. It was despicable what they did.
And that happened. Yeah. but that happened also as part of 1920 with San Remo, with the granting of these mandates, because several of the mandates were granted also in Africa. So anyway, but there were a lot of objections about the mandates at that time, because there are 15 of them, and people, certain peoples didn't like certain ones. I mean, I will give you the most obvious example that I can give you, and that would be the Kurds. Okay, the Kurds are a proud ancient people, and they were promised a state, and they don't have one still to this day, and no mandate was drawn to give them one. They live mostly in northern Syria, northern Iraq. That area was supposed to be theirs. They weren't given that land. I mean, we can get into all kinds of reasons and things like that, but basically, Britain was promising everything to everybody at the end of World War I, and so was France, and so was Germany to a degree, because they were all vying for position to get assistance from local populations. And so anyway, 1920, the mandates come into effect, and it was by treaty. So this is actual international law. This is one thing to understand and know, and coming from a lawyer, it needs to be understood. All those resolutions that they pass in the United Nations are worth the paper they're written on and nothing more. You will notice that all of those resolutions start with the United Nations General Assembly recommends, or the United Nations General Assembly condemns, or the United Nations General Assembly recognizes. Okay, they can only pontificate. They don't actually have any enforcement power or the ability to make or create laws whatsoever. Treaties are what states are bound to, okay, not UN resolutions. That's why a lot of people refer to the UN today as a modern Tower of Babel. That's basically all it is. There are some parts of the UN that does good work and yada yada, but the General Assembly is a cesspool. The so-called Human Rights Committee of the UN, which was largely started by Eleanor Roosevelt because of what happened to the Jews in the Holocaust, she would be turning over in her grave to know how it has become one of the most anti-Semitic organizations on earth, and the people who run the human rights, watches are some of the biggest human rights abusers on the planet. Your Iranians, your Libyans, your Syrians, your Cubans, your Russians. Russia was actually finally just kicked off. Amazing there. There's somebody, if you want to know more about this, there's an organization that's an NGO called UN Watch. It's run by a guy named Hillel Neuer. He's based out of Geneva, and you can look up some of his videos and some of the things that he has pointed out about the hypocrisy of that body. But so anyway, that's the United Nations. But what preceded the United Nations was the League of Nations. There were only 38 countries at that point that were part of the League of Nations, because it was just a smaller world then. There were a lot of empires that were now being broken up. So they created this mandate system. And one of the mandates that they gave was the mandate for Palestine, which was given to the British. And of all the 15 mandates that were given out, that was the least controversial. Almost nobody raised an objection. I'm not actually even aware of anybody raising an objection to it, because everybody knew the Jews come from there. So if we are trying to give self-determination rights to peoples from these lands, we're going to give, they were already going to give 11 million square miles of land to the Arabs, who did not have nation states. They were just going to slice them up into nation states and say, you're now a Libyan. You're now a Syrian. You're now an Iraqi. You're now a Kuwaiti. Yeah, but they were all Arabs. In fact, there were a lot of people who were fighting for a pan-Arab state to cover the entire land. They didn't want to be broken up into nation states. But this is what was done anyway. And the mandate for Palestine was the least controversial of them all. The mandate for Palestine, specifically from the League of Nations, and it is one of their legal abilities under Article 24 of the League of Nations Charter to be able to, or maybe it's 22, I'm sorry, to be able to set up these mandates so they were legal and under international law as it stood. And that has been upheld ever since. That's why when Saddam Hussein in 1990 or 91 went into Kuwait, because he said, Why should tiny little Kuwait with its small population have 300 miles of coast, and us, Iraq, with our tens of millions, have 30 miles of coastland? It's a pretty good argument. He wasn't the only one making it. That had been the argument for the mandate for Mesopotamia all the way through to original Iraqis. It was just that Saddam Hussein was the one who tried to act on it. And he went in to take Kuwait, which he said had no right to exist. It was just drawn up by some, crusty white guys across the world. But the world said, no, these are the borders. And they kicked him out of Kuwait. And they've done that repeatedly around the world. They have maintained these borders. And there's a reason for that. There has to be an international law that fits every single time a new country is created, because you might not realize it, but that's something that happens all the time. Just think about, for example, when the Soviet Union collapsed, how many new countries suddenly came into being. Okay, new countries happen quite a bit. And so there's an axiomatic international law, meaning it applies no matter what. And it's so that there are defined borders, so that every time a new state is created, there isn't this battle over every inch of borders, that it's just understood that everybody knows that these are the borders. And it's a Latin phrase, because we lawyers and our Latin phrases that we like to use to try to make us sound fancy. The phrase is uti potestatis juris. And all it means are the borders are what the last geopolitical borders of the last administrative government were. So that's why, for example, look at Crimea. Was Crimea a part of Ukraine as opposed to Russia because its people were, closer in culture or in language to the Ukrainians than the Russians? No. By and large, the people of Crimea are closer in language and culture to Russia, not to Ukraine. Is it because the people there? I'm sorry, can I just finish this one point and then I will stop? I know I've been going for a while, and then I'll stop. It's because the people there were given a referendum. Which do you want to belong to, Russia or Ukraine? No, there's no referendum whatsoever. In fact, if you had tried to do one, most likely the people of Crimea would have, and it's not all of them, but it would have been a substantial majority, would have said we'd rather be a part of Russia than Ukraine. The whole reason is because at some point in the 50s, the Kremlin redrew the borders of their Soviet socialist republics. And when they redrew those borders, it included Crimea with Ukraine. And that was just the way it was. So when the Soviet Union fell and Ukraine proclaimed their independence, under uti potestatis juris, an axiomatic law of international law that exists always, the borders were what the last administrative entity was that they had the borders in that area, and that was the Soviet Union that had the borders that included Crimea. And so when Russia, just similarly to what Saddam Hussein did with Kuwait, but years ago, before this most recent conflict, when Putin went in and took Crimea, it was for the same reason. He said there was never any purpose to it. These people are mostly Russians, they're not Ukrainians. This land is ours. But the world doesn't recognize it. The world sees Crimea as Russian-occupied Ukraine. And just because they stay there for a long period of time isn't going to suddenly give them squatters' rights that will change that law. It will still be that is international law, is that it is what the borders were. So anyway, that's the point I wanted to get at. I know that you wanted to jump in, Andrew, so I wanted to let you, and thank you for letting me finish that.
Oh, yeah. Well, this is actually on the point that you were making. So this recognition of previous borders, is it a law, or is this more a stare decisis kind of thing? Are we recognizing previous precedent, or is there a body of law that you can point to? I'd love to include it in the show notes, because this is the kind of thing that some of our listeners get into. And speaking as somebody who goes back and listens to our episodes occasionally, I'm one of those listeners, so I'm interested too. And so if there's some international law that we can sink our teeth into in the future, because borders do get redrawn, right? So a recognition of borders doesn't seem to be a guarantee that history will repeat itself, because Right now, what is happening in Ukraine and Crimea is an attempt by Moscow to redraw borders back to the days of the Cold War, right? Now I realize those borders would largely look like the World War II map, okay? But the point is that we do redraw borders over time, and so I'm interested.
We redraw borders by
language.
treaty.
Sure.
By agreement, which is what would have happened if Arafat had accepted the deal in 2000, or if Abbas accepted the deal that was offered to him in 2008, or if the Arabs accepted the UN partition plan in 47, or if they accepted the British Peel Commission plan in 1937. The point is, every time they've had an opportunity to redraw the borders based off of a treaty that would actually create new borders, they've said no, because we will not agree to a Jewish state in any borders. And so therefore, since they lost the war, they attacked after Israel declared its independence, they don't have the ability to then claim to be the victims of the war they launched and lost.
Sure.
They had an opportunity.
So what's the treaty then that decides Israel's borders? To bring it back onto track.
So
we're not leaving
unless
we're
there's
right
a treaty. Yeah, unless there's a treaty, the borders follow the doctrine known as its UTI, one word. Second word is Posidetis, Possidetis, juris, Juris. That is a doctrine of international law that is applied 100% of the time. The only time that it has ever not been automatically applied are when people talk about Israel, they try to ignore it and pretend like it doesn't actually exist. But it has applied across the board to every other country. And to the extent that borders are changed, can only be for a couple of reasons. One's by treaty. Another is you cannot take land legally in an offensive war. You can take land under international law in a defensive war.
So I was going to get that because we get to treaties very often through armed conflict, right? And not always. We can have very reasonable actors coming up with treaties. I'm not suggesting it never happens, but very often we get to treaties through armed conflict, and sometimes those treaty lines get drawn very much based on where a ceasefire is called. We're willing to call it quits along these lines from time to time. Again, I'd love for you to include some links to relevant international law here, because it's fascinating.
I'd be happy to. Yeah.
But you've said something there that I think is also equally fascinating. So are you saying, by the way, I have no ability to argue with this one way or the other. This is me asking you a question as a legal professional and then just having to accept the answer.
You can always call me out about it later if you find a lawyer who disagrees with me, and I'll be happy to speak with them or to answer your question.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I took 2 law classes in college, and I thought about pre-law, and then well, computers then consumed me, but I did love it then, and I keep up with my legal reading to the extent that a novice can, right, which doesn't say very much because novices should never try to be lawyers. Okay, look, here's my point. In a war, it is sometimes hard to go back and determine the aggressor, right? And so it seems to me, and maybe I'm wrong here, that it's an overclaim that an aggressor never gets awarded some territory during a treaty after a war.
If the United States were to just decide, you know what, we're going to go ahead and invade the Canadian province of Saskatchewan and claim it as our own. Okay?
We don't want Saskatchewan.
No, but this...
They can't even pronounce it. Why would they want it?
Right. Okay, Alberta. Let's do Alberta instead. That's easier to say. If the United States decided to, for whatever reason. Okay, we've had some lunatics be in the White House before. Who knows? Let's say that the United States decides that they want Alberta, Canada, because I don't know, they've got some natural resources or some oil there that we want. So we're just going to go in and take it.
It's winter skiing. That's
okay. Winter skiing. So we take it. Okay, it is now. We put the American flag in there, and we say this is American. The world will not recognize that, okay? But if the Canadians want to get rid of us, they have to go against the United States Army, which is probably not going to look too good for the Canadians. So the Canadians can fight, and they would be in the right for doing so because they have been aggressed and they have been wrongfully invaded. But if the Canadians ultimately decide to enter into a treaty giving the Americans a portion of that land, that becomes the new law.
Sort of
we enforce treaties. Yeah.
Right. My point was more along the lines that very often the winners write the history books, but not really to argue the legal point, because I have no ability to argue the legal point. And I'm trying to get very subtly to what is going on between Israel and Hamas right now. So why is all of this relevant to that? Because I can see the gears turning in Matthew's head. Andrew, what are you on about? I'm trying to decide how the world will respond to whatever redrawing may come about as a result of this conflict. And I think there's some really interesting, if the world is as anti-Semitic as some of the things you say suggest, then Israel can fight from now until whatever improbable point in the future. And in some ways, it's not going to matter, is what it sounds like.
Israel does not want to retake Gaza. It's as simple as that. Israel has no interest in ruling over the Gaza Strip or the Palestinians that live there. They uprooted. I mean, if you look at the videos, I was in Israel when this was happening, actually, and it was very difficult it was heartbreaking. These people, they had built lives there for decades. They had their schools, they had their synagogues, they had their supermarkets, they had their houses, they had their lives, they had where their kids were going. And Jews were coming in to expel other Jews for the first time in history from a part of their ancient homeland. This was mind-boggling for a lot of people at the time, but most Israelis supported it because it was a way to try to push peace forward since we couldn't find anybody to make a treaty with. So we said, we're just going to give you this land and see what you do with it. Go ahead, it's all yours. Then Hamas came into power. So now the goal is not to retake the Gaza Strip. It is to oust Hamas. That's the goal. Israel does not want to gain any territory as a result of this.
Not a goal that I have a problem with. And I would feel that way regardless of the terrorist organization. I wouldn't care whether it was Hamas or some white nationalist group that wants to take a national park in the United States. Look it up, folks. I'm not making this stuff up. I didn't choose.
No, that exists. Yeah.
I didn't make it up. It sounds crazy. It did happen. So I am for eliminating terrorists because they're terrorists, right?
That's Hamas.
Right. But I wonder, so let's say that Israel eliminates Hamas. A thing, by the way, that I think is extraordinarily improbable regardless of the length of the prosecution of this conflict. Okay.
That's a fair assessment.
Yeah, not because I think Israel is incapable, but because as human beings, I think we're incapable of eliminating terrorism. But let's say they do. That leaves a power vacuum that we have seen over and over and over and over again as nation states.
You're talking about an exit strategy, right?
Well,
You want to know what's Israel's exit strategy? If they don't want to take the land, they don't want to reoccupy it, what's their exit strategy? Is that basically what you're asking?
Sure, because the U.S. has sort of got egg on its face for a particular recent thing
Sure.
that didn't have
absolutely.
a particularly well-defined
I
exit
can tell
strategy.
you, Israel is not going to announce their exit strategy right now because facts on the ground can change things and they don't want to be beholden to things that they said now. But generally speaking, for those of us who are involved in this on a daily basis and have studied the conflict the way that I have, it seems pretty clear that it's going to be given back to the PA. That, the Palestinian Authority is essentially the lesser of two evils. So Abbas will once again be in charge of both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip at the end of this war. That is most likely. This is me not speaking with historical fact. This is me giving you my opinion, an educated guess.
Right. There's not a historical fact to be had here, is there? We're trying to figure out.
You're asking about the future. Yeah.
Right. We're talking about future history. Let's say that it happens along those lines, that Israel is to a greater degree successful in eliminating Hamas, right? To the extent that the terror organization is driven far underground and they don't have the ability to prosecute for their own ends in the near future. Okay, now we have this power vacuum. Israel hands Gaza over to the PA. I mean, it's just sort of a gesture of international goodwill at that point, really. But let's say it happens that way for whatever reason. Is there a peace hope after that?
Maybe. It really all comes down to what look, here's the best way for me to describe it to you. You know that Israel is willing to trade land for peace because you've seen it before. You saw Israel give the entire Sinai to Egypt with Anwar Sadat in the 70s, and there was a treaty between Israel and Egypt that still holds today. Okay? The point is, Israel requires defensible borders, just like any other country. If Israel were to, and listen, the proper, and we can get into this another time unless you want to hear it now, in which case I will. I can tell you just as a lawyer and just as a trust me for now, and then I'll explain it whenever you want. The legal way to refer to the West Bank is disputed territory. Okay, it is actually just something that's been repeated over and over and over to call it occupied territory. It looks like occupied territory in some ways, but it's actually not. It's actually disputed territory. And that's part of Iudipotedis juris, because the borders on the day that Israel declared its independence were the borders of the Mandate for Palestine, which was from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. And the entities that moved into the West Bank and to Gaza were the brand new country of Jordan, which took the West Bank, and Egypt, which took Gaza. There was no Palestinian state. They didn't make one. Nobody was calling for one. And they occupied those areas for 19 years until the Six-Day War in 1967. And nobody ever tried to create a Palestinian state during that time. There was not a single Jew living there. They'd all been ethnically cleansed out of there. There was not a single Israeli force. Israel was barely hanging on in those days. They were not the military and financial success that they are today. They were surrounded by 200 million Arabs counting their blessings that they would get one more day. And that was the only, when people call them 67 borders, it's a misnomer. There were never borders, ever. All they were the 1949 armistice lines. It's where the Israelis and the Jordanians stopped fighting. That's what that line is that they call the 67 borders on the West Bank. And specifically in that armistice, it says these armistice lines shall not be construed as borders. As long as Israel can share that land, because Israel has given portions of, there's areas A, B, and C. Again, we're going to get a little bit too much into the weeds here, but understand that when Israel entered into the Oslo Accords, starting around 93, with the PLO and recognizing the PLO as the rightful leaders of the Palestinian people, that's when they turned over the keys to certain Arab towns in the West Bank that were, 100% Arab. That because Israel did not want to be ruling over them. So it gave them full autonomy, something short of statehood at this point, because it was supposed to be done in stages. But, they gave them, the areas like Ramallah, which is where the capital is today, where Abbas's headquarters are. They gave them Jericho, certain areas like that. That's Area A that's under complete Palestinian control and has been, for 2 decades now. But the bottom line is, if Israel was to do in the West Bank what it did in 2005 in Gaza, Israel would be committing suicide, because the thinnest point that Israel would have between the West Bank and Tel Aviv, its most populous city, is 9 miles. That's it. Okay, those rockets that they fire from Gaza that hit the small communities in the area, well, now they can hit all the major population centers in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, in Netanya. They can hit Ben Gurion International Airport. It puts the entire country at risk, which is why Israel cannot just unilaterally leave the West Bank, which it has claims to regardless, and it's disputed land, but Israel is willing to negotiate over it. But the bottom line is that as long as Israel is left with with borders that are defensible, then there's no reason that the land can't be shared. So I wanted that to be sort of understood, and that's what the peace process is all about. It has to be land for something. So far, Israel has given land and it has not gotten peace. Okay, it did get peace for land with Egypt. It got it with Jordan. Syria said no, so it doesn't have it with Syria. So far, it has given land to the Palestinians and it has gotten no peace in return.
Gentlemen, I'm at a viciously hard stop. I don't have any choice. I have an obligation that I can't avoid.
So Eric, we're probably close to your...
I can stay on for at least a little while if you like. I'm also okay with cutting it off now.
Yeah, I can't either. Then just quickly then, before we go, this episode hasn't really gone the way I anticipated, but then that's how these things go. I still enjoyed the conversation. I enjoyed hearing Andrew talk a lot more this time. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you again, Eric. Listeners, I hope you appreciated the way that this one has gone. Any questions, any pushback, reasonpress@gmail.com. You know how to find us. If you want to challenge Eric on anything like that, use the same email address and we'll forward that on to Eric. Very quickly, very briefly, Eric, what quick message would you like to give to our listeners, specifically if there's any Palestinian listeners? I have no idea if we do have, that would try to encourage some kind of positive steps forwards over the rest of this year. And I've put you on the spot there. I apologize. I didn't prepare you for this.
It's fine. I have my response. We are family. What's happened here now, I mean, if you go back, we are cousins. At the very least, the Jews and the Arabs are cousins, sons of Ishmael and Jacob. We are cousins. Or there's also the research out there is pretty supportive of this now, that it's a wide margin, but somewhere between 30 and 60% of all modern day Palestinians were Jews who were forcibly converted. So we might not just be cousins, we might actually be brothers and sisters. So regardless of what has happened and the horrible things that people think about one another today, we are just a big dysfunctional family. And the Jews are never going to leave this land, and neither are the Arabs, and I don't want them to. I want the Jews and the Arabs to be able to live here. I want everyone to be able to visit any part of the land. I want to be able to live in peace. If the state of Israel can be able to tell its people that it is secure, it's okay, we won't be massacred the way we were on October 7th, the way we've been massacred for decades, going back to at least 1920 by local Arabs there. That's what everybody wants. That's why post-Oslo in the early and mid-90s was a time of great optimism. When that handshake took place on the White House lawn, I mean, everybody had stars in their eyes. It was just amazing. We're finally going to do this. and basically, I can describe it another time, but Arafat destroyed it. I mean, there were a Saudi prince whose name escapes me at the moment, who called Arafat's turning down of the offer at Camp David a crime against the Palestinian people. And I agree with that. They could have had their own state. They should have had their own state. And at that time, the animosity wasn't what it has turned into, that it might even be successful. And we might be living in a very different world today. I want to get back there, but I also realize that it's not going to happen overnight, that it's going to take a lot of really one-on-one conversations. We've been two peoples that have been largely kept apart as a result of Israel having to do things for security reasons during the Second Intifada, and the security fence and like checkpoints and things like that we don't really intermingle the way that we used to. But there's 20% of the population of Israel that's Arab, and they live pretty good lives. And the vast majority of them don't want to move anywhere else. And if there was a Palestinian state, they wouldn't move there. They like their lives in Israel. They consider themselves Israelis. In fact, I saw a recent statistic that only, I think, 20% of Arab Israeli citizens consider themselves, quote unquote, Palestinians. The remainder consider themselves either Arab Israelis or just Israelis. That's their country. That's all they've ever known. They live there in peace. It's a nation of laws. They have more rights than, unfortunately, any other Arab citizens do of any other country in the entire Middle East. They have more freedoms, more ability to live lives. I mean, the percentage of Arabs in Israel is 20%, but the percentage of those in healthcare, particularly doctors, is over 30% Arab. The percentage of Arabs in universities is actually higher per capita than it is of Jews. I mean, they have tons of opportunity there that they just can't get in a lot of these Arab countries that are unfortunately still dictatorships, and where individual rights are not respected. So they don't want to go anywhere. So my bottom line is, we are one big dysfunctional family, but even today we are living together in Israel. Now, there's no Jews living in, the PA controlled areas. And according to Mahmoud Abbas, there will never, ever be a Jew allowed to live in a future Palestinian state. So there won't be any intermingling there, which is why I don't think that's the answer either. I think that we need to be in one another's lives, because then we see one another as the human beings that we are, as the families that we are, as the dysfunctional family members who need to come together. And it's really hard to say right now because of all the horrible images that we've been seeing and everything on TV and on the internet and everything like that. But at the end of the day, families fight, and Hamas, they're not our family. They are terrorists. They are excommunicated entirely. They no longer have any right to claim anything. We will take them out no matter what it costs. We will take them out. We will stop them from having the ability to make war, to carry out massacres against Jews. And the Palestinians that are still there, if I could embrace every one of them, I would, just to say, I don't hate you. I don't dislike you. You're my family. I want you to have a good life. I want your children to have a good life. Can we please work together so that we can have better futures for your children and for mine? And most Israelis, the vast majority, would go along with this, because every time there has been even the hint of an opportunity for peace, they call for elections, and the peacenik candidate wins in a landslide. It's just the way it goes. But when Israelis see that when they reach their hands out in peace is slapped away with suicide bombings or these massacres, the Israelis have become jaded. They do not believe that there is a peace partner among the Palestinians. They just see leaders that refuse to make peace, and they see an entire people who hate us and want us in the ground. It was Golda Meir going back to the 70s who said, it's really simple at the end of the day, because we want to be alive and they want us to be dead. So therefore, we have no choice but to fight. It is what it is, So that's essentially my point here, is that there needs to be a change in the ideology, which means there needs to be a change in the leadership. And then there needs to be a change in the mindset of the people on the ground. And that's not something that can just be forced. I mean, does need to be a certain amount of denazification, essentially, certainly of Gaza, because it has been under the control of Hamas now for 18 years. And Hamas is in everything the same way that the Nazi Party was in everything in Germany from 1933 to 1945. So a certain amount of something similar to denazification has to occur. But more than that, I mean, look at it today. It's possible. You can't tell me it's not possible, because Israel and Germany have great relations today. Go tell a Holocaust survivor in 1945 that that's going to happen. They'd probably punch you in the face. You know, call you crazy. If Israel can have these wonderful relations with Germany, there's no reason they can't also one day have them with the Palestinians. I also would just point out that the religion of Islam only came into being in the 7th century CE. Okay, it means it's only been around for less than 1400 years. Okay, when the Christian religion was roughly 1400 years old, they weren't too nice to the Jews either. In fact, they were a lot worse. That's just the honest truth. And now Jews and Christians, by and large, get along quite well. In fact, there's now this phrase that gets used quite often of Judeo-Christian values, which would be incredible to any Jew born before at least 1950, if not a lot, later than that even. But the point is that no matter how, no matter what some other people did to you in the past or did to your ancestors, there is hope at the end of the day. I'll finish by quoting one of the most quotable Jews and just great thinkers, who also happens to be British, the late Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. And I really hope get this exactly right, because he deserves it. And what he said essentially is, any Jew familiar with our history cannot possibly be an optimist. But any Jew worthy of the name would never give up hope. So we understand that if we set ourselves up with high expectations, history tells us we're going to be very disappointed, and perhaps, and most likely, violently. But that doesn't mean we ever give up hope. Israel has always wanted peace with its neighbors. It's in their Declaration of Independence. They begged the Arabs to stay and be a part of the nation that they were building, not to leave, which the Arab countries were calling on them to do, so that they could go in and just wipe out the entire population of Jews from this nascent state of Israel. So that's my message, essentially, is that I don't care anymore. I care about the history because I'm a historian and I think it matters, and because there are people out there trying to delegitimize the state of Israel and trying to claim that Israel doesn't have a right to self-defense. And I'm going to fight that tooth and nail as if I was on the front lines with a weapon. Okay, my weapon just happens to be words. But the day that there is a Palestinian Sadat, the man in Egypt who made peace with Menachem Begin, the prime minister of Israel in the 70s, the day that there's a Palestinian Sadat, somebody who's willing to make concessions and share land and actually trade something for land, peace, an end to all claims, an end to belligerency. That is the day that you will find a very happy partner among Israelis, because they've always been striving for it. And so we are a family. We're a dysfunctional family. Horrible things have happened and are continuing to happen. But there are going to be generations that are going to come after us, and all of them deserve better lives than what we've had and what the people before us have had. And they aren't going anywhere, Palestinians, and we aren't going anywhere, the Jews. And the problem is that most Palestinians from, polling believe that the Jews are going to be gone someday and they just have to wait us out. We're never leaving. This is our home. They don't understand that. They think we come from somewhere else. No, it's our home. We're never leaving. If that ever can sink in, perhaps they won't want to be in a perpetual state of war either, and they'll be willing to share the land. But it's going to take a Palestinian Sadat. It's going to take a Palestinian ruler who is willing to put the future and safety and needs of his own people ahead of any ideology, ahead of any personal, gains. I mean, Sadat paid for it with his life, years afterward he was assassinated. So, I mean, it's not easy to be an Arab Sadat, but I pray that one day there will be a Palestinian Sadat, whether that's a religious prayer or just a hope for the future can be up to the listener. But I honestly believe that there already would have been peace many times over had there been anyone even close to Sadat, and that if there ever is one in the future, there will be peace. And it may take us a few generations because of all the hate and all the violence and all the horrible things that have happened. But at the end of the day, we are a family and we will come together.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Andrew. Always great to share a mic with you. And with that, dear listeners, until the next one, stay reasonable. You have been listening to a podcast from Reason Press. Do you have any thoughts on what you've just heard? Do you have a topic that you would like us to cover? Please send all feedback to reasonpress@gmail.com. You might even appear on an episode. Our theme music was written for us by Holly. To hear more of her music, see the links in our show notes.